welcome to the Dark Night of the Soul Unwrapped.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. What was going on in your life around the time your Dark Night of the Soul first began?
I've been thinking about this, and I guess I think I've had a series of dark nights of the soul throughout my life, or there's been a kind of build up, and then the big one, and then aftershocks, I suppose. But the big one happened in 1989 when I was 29 years old. I had two small children. They'd quite recently separated from their father and was experiencing issues with homelessness. I mean, all sorts of social issues, really. And I was also being accused of fraud because I'd moved from one place where the council was paying my housing benefit. I'd actually been moved by the council to another place. So I assumed that they knew that I'd moved to another place. So I didn't inform them that I needed my housing benefit checks sent to a new address. And they carried on sending them to my old address, which was a big shared house, and someone was cashing them. So all of this was going on. I didn't have anywhere stable to live. My mental health had not been great for a while ever, really. I think there were a lot of things that happened in my childhood that were their own little dark nights. And I began to lose my grip on consensus reality. It happened kind of gradually. I can remember I had a hospital appointment. I'd also seriously injured my back and I wasn't able to walk. I was in a lot of pain. I was having to stay with my mother, which was challenging in itself. And I remember standing in the hospital waiting room and just thinking in quite an impassionate way, I wonder what would happen if I just started to scream, and just looking around at all the people and thinking, I wonder what they'd do. I didn't do it, but it was there. It was like there was this huge scream already building inside me, and the scream grew gradually louder and louder. And I was a little bit disconnected from it, but also it was there and it possessed me. And this particular time when everything just shut down, broke down, I was on the phone at my mother's house. I was on the phone to the housing officer at the local council who was trying to get housed. They wouldn't house me because of this fraud thing that was going on. And I was talking to this guy and he was just saying the same old stuff. And I was trying to get across to him how desperate I was and how I hadn't done anything wrong and I needed a stable place for my children. And suddenly I didn't recognize the words. No, that's not how it worked, actually. Suddenly I recognized the words he was saying as individual words, but they didn't make sense anymore. I just couldn't make any sense of what he was saying. And then maybe that went on for a minute or so, and it was very strange. And I was quite detached from it, just watching, what's going on here? And then a curtain came down in my mind and I saw it. And initially it was like it was made of metal. It was made of steel, I think. Although I think it was possibly, I was drawing upon the concept of the Iron Curtain because there was lots of stuff going on about Russia. It was the Cold War, or past the end of the Cold War, but I'd been very involved in the peace movement, and this curtain came down in my head, and then it was replaced, or maybe it was still there, but a pair of red velvet curtains pulled across it, and they were really ornate, like old-time theatre or something. These curtains pulled across, and there was nothing. There were no thoughts. They cut me off from my thoughts. It was like these curtains shut off my conscious mind. And I think that's when I started to scream. I remember my mother taking me upstairs and putting me to bed. And I remember sleeping and waking up And I woke up and the thoughts were still not there. And I very clearly remember my mother was panicking, what's going on? What's wrong with you? And I remember somewhere this little voice came out of my mouth and it said, I'm having a breakdown and it's going to go on for a long time, but it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to me. And then totally lost touch with consensus reality. And I found myself in this hellscape, which was full of monsters and demons, and it was terrifying. And I know I did a lot of screaming and a lot of crying, but I only know that because people have told me since. I was just taken into this. It was the hell that I had been threatened with when I was a child. I was brought up in a very strongly Catholic community. I never fitted in. I was a very questioning child, and I had a really strong sense of what spirituality was and what God was, although I didn't know the language. And it wasn't what I was being told it was by the Catholic Church. And I really wanted to share what I inherently knew. So I would say, no, God wouldn't do that. God wouldn't send people to hell. God wouldn't punish people. God loves people. And I'd ask questions, and I was told I was evil from very, very young. I can remember being told that I was evil and I would go to hell when I was 4. I went to a convent for a while when I was 4. And being told in no uncertain terms with illustrations what hell was and what would happen to me there. And that's where I found myself.
Thank you. There's already so much in this. Looking back now, what's your sense of the steel curtain, the red velvet curtains that came across? What were they doing? Did they serve some kind of purpose or?
Yeah, I think it was time for me to be cut off from my conscious mind, from all the conditioning, all the self-hatred, the second guessing, the pressure I was putting on myself to do everything properly, to fit in, to be a good citizen. I'd never felt comfortable with that. And I felt very polarized because I'd always, right from being really young, I'd wanted to be a good girl, and I'd wanted to do what the people who loved me and the people who were the authority figures in my community told me I should do, and be what they told me I should be. But also I wasn't that. And I didn't want to be. I wanted to be for them, and I wanted to be because it was really difficult and painful not to be. But I think actually more, I wanted them to be more like me and to believe what I believed and to see the world the way that I saw it. So I grew up in a very polarized way, trying to be what other people wanted me to be, but also needing to be true to my conscience and to what I believed was the truth. And it all got so muddled and so messy and chaotic, and something had to give. And I think that's what the curtain was about. It was just, that's enough now. Let's have a clean slate for a while and see what happens.
I think what you just described really cuts to the heart of, I think, what the dark night and its aftershocks are about. That we've been trying to be that, but we're also yearning to be this. That we're trying to be what people around us in society want, and yet there's this deep call to be ourselves. And I think that polarization, that split or fracture, in my understanding, is fundamentally causes, if we like, the dark night of the soul. So, yeah, thank you for articulating that. In that hellscape, looking back on it now, what's your sense of what was happening when you were out of consensual reality in that hellscape?
I guess I was facing my deepest fears, certainly not from choice or not from conscious choice. It was terrifying beyond any words. And also, I was there, I was in that without any sense of anything else for 2 weeks, but it felt like there was no sense of time. So it could have been 100 years. And it was extremely traumatic. And I would never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, choose to go there again. But I came out of it. And I guess when I came out of it, there was maybe not immediately consciously, because it took a really long time for anything to make much sense in a continual way consciously. But there was an awareness that I'd gone there. I'd been terrified of going to hell consciously as a child, and then I think I'd kind of switched it off as an adult. I broke with Catholicism when I was 13 in a very angry way. So I had no time for any kind of organized religion, and I very much conditioned myself to believe that there wasn't a hell and it wasn't a threat. But that little girl part of me was still there and was still terrified. And I came to the conclusion when I was a child, at I don't know what age, maybe when my dad died when I was 8, that there was just no point. There's no point fighting this. I'm going to hell. And, you know, that's just the way it is. I'm not strong enough to be all the things that I'm supposed to be in order to be good, and I'm going to hell. So that was there, that was planted, it was always there. And even though I convinced myself mentally that wasn't the case, yeah, I still, there was still a fear. I remember when everybody went to see The Exorcist because it was the thing to do, and I wouldn't even have a conversation about it. It frightened me so much. All that supernatural evil stuff really, really frightened me. So to go there and to experience that and to come out the other side was really significant. I don't think I've ever really thought about that before. It was like, okay, if I can survive that and if I can come back, then I'm stronger than I ever thought I was.
I mean, what comes to me is the phrase, to hell and back. You went to hell and back. And I would imagine that given your upbringing, the vividness, the acuteness of that hell would be even more than maybe for somebody who hadn't been brought up like that,
Well,
possibly. My sense of certainly the first part of my dark night, the word underworld really resonated. So it was a very similar kind of feel. Mine was experienced within consensual reality somewhat. I mean, so there was no curtains cutting me off from everyday consciousness. But as you described, it's really the sum of our worst fears. As you came out, what then happened when you came back from hell?
I was in and out of consensus reality and what I'm actually now quite comfortable to call madness. I had been seen by my mother's GP while I was not, not conscious really of what was going on. And she prescribed various medications. And as soon as I found out that I'd been taking these medications, I'd been taking them unquestioningly, I stopped. There was still no thoughts. Everything was instinct, intuition, images. And I knew that I needed to not be taking medication. So I stopped. I stopped taking the medication. A psychiatrist came round to the house to assess me. And I remember meeting him and shaking his hand. And he towered above me. In my memory, he's about 8 feet tall and he was a corpse. I just knew he was dead. He wasn't alive. His hand was cold and he was grey and now in my memory, he's a bit dressed like a vampire, but, probably I may have embellished that. But there was something very definitely significant about the fact that this guy was dead. There was no warmth in him. There was no sense of aliveness. There was no connection. And I remember him asking me questions. I don't remember what the questions were. And I also remember that I knew, just as I knew I mustn't take the medication, I knew with absolute certainty that I mustn't tell this guy what was really going on. So I answered his questions minimally. I went into what I later came to call the automaton, which was a way of being in the world where I kind of automatically behaved like a human being. I didn't feel as though I was a human being. I didn't feel as though I was existing in the human world, but I knew how to play the game. Sometimes I didn't. But when I really needed to, I came to realize later I could slot into this, and I hated it because it felt really inauthentic, but I could do it. And it was a protective thing. So I answered his questions minimally and in as sensible and human a way as I could. And I remember at one point he said quite accusingly, "You're not depressed." Somebody had obviously told him I was depressed. Anyway, I was diagnosed with psychosis despite my best efforts. And he referred me to a psychiatric day hospital, which was close to my mother's house. And she drove me there every day. And I went there for 2 weeks. It was a place where people went, most of them very heavily medicated. And there were activities like yoga and music appreciation and therapy sessions, but on quite a shallow level. And by this time, I was having incredible insights, and it felt like I was tapping into the secrets of the universe. And I really needed to be able to explore. This has never happened to me before. And it was like I knew things that I'd never learned. And nobody at the day hospital wanted to know that, except there were two guys. Most of the other patients were heavily medicated, didn't really interact very much, but there were two guys, one of whom I used to work with. So that was really nice. We'd been kind of friends and then lost contact. And I had some great conversations with them. But the staff, well, there was one member of staff. She was a nurse. She was called Doreen. And she really didn't like me. She thought I was a bad influence on these other people. She didn't like the things I said in group. And she ran a session which was for people who were beginning to think that they might want to come off their medication one day. And I went to this group and I sat there, and she was asking everybody how long they'd been on their medication. And I said, I haven't taken my medication, for 3 weeks or whatever it was by then. And she was horrified. And she said, "You can't come off those doses of medication just like that." And I said, "Well, I have." And she said, "Well, you're going to have to go back on them and come off them gradually." And I was just like, "What?" No, no, I'm not going to start taking them again. I'm fine. I mean, I wasn't fine. And I don't know how much of that might have been sudden withdrawal from these medications. But anyway, she was pressuring me to go back on this medication, and she gave it to me, and she was very aggressive. And then there were a couple more. I mean, there were lots actually of just unpleasantnesses with this woman. There was, in the medication group, they gave us a list of all the things we shouldn't be doing while we were on medication. And on the list was no caffeine, no sugar. And then immediately after the group, there was a coffee break, and there was just coffee, caffeinated tea, and sugary biscuits. So then for the next group, I got my mum to get some herbal tea and some barley cup, which was what we all used to drink instead of coffee at the time, and some sugar-free fruit bars. And I took them in and put them on the side. And Doreen was furious, and she gathered them all up and she said, "You put these back in your bag." And I was saying, but no, you put these back in your bag. It's not your place. in the end, I had enough of it, and I walked out and I gave her a medication back. And then I just felt lost. I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't be around my children. I couldn't, I'm not going to go into that, but I couldn't. So I was finding it increasingly difficult to be staying at my mother's. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I went back to see the same psychiatrist, and as I walked in, he just looked up and said, "I hear you've been making trouble." And he said that since I'd messed it up at the day hospital, he recommended that I should go to a residential asylum type hospital and take medication. He was very adamant that I should be taking medication. And I said, no, I couldn't take medication. When I thought about taking medication, the image that came to me, it wasn't a thought, it was an image, and it was a tiny, tiny flickering, like a tea light that's nearly gone out. And it was somewhere really deep inside me, in my soul, but I pictured it as being somewhere around my solar plexus, in the really hidden little nooks and crannies there. It was very nearly out, and it was all that was left of who I really was. And I knew that if I took medication, that would go out, and that would be the end. It'd be the end of who I was, and I might never get myself back. And I explained this to him, and he didn't listen. He didn't hear. He just said, "You don't want to be helped," and dismissed me, really. Told me to come back when I'd come to my senses. And I was distraught. I left, and I was absolutely distraught. And I was just walking, and I went round a corner, and I literally bumped into someone that I'd known, who was a friend, but not a good friend, and I hadn't seen for months. And she said, "Oh, hello, how are you?" And I said, "I've just walked out of a psychiatric hospital." And she said, "Come and have a cup of tea." And she took me to a cafe, and I told her what had happened. And she said, "Oh, come and stay with me." And that was the beginning. I had 3 sets of friends, all of whom opened up their homes to me, gave me keys, all of whom had no expectations. They gave me a spare room. They gave me hugs if I needed them. They left me alone if I needed to cry or scream into a pillow, which I did a lot. And I had this rule, which was I couldn't stay in any one place for more than 3 days, because it wasn't safe. It wasn't safe to stay in the same place. And it was just amazing. Nobody questioned me. Nobody put any pressure on me. These 3 lots of friends all trusted me to be okay, where lots of other people were just like really worried about what was going on with me, and I should be taking medication, and I should be in hospital, and was I safe? They just let me be. And I am so, so grateful. I'm only still in touch with one of those people, but I honestly think, they could have saved my life. And I was flipping between realities, dimensions. I didn't know any of that language. And I was writing in a journal, so I wasn't having thoughts, but I was writing everything in a journal. And I didn't feel real. I didn't believe I was real. I didn't believe I was human. But if I was writing, then I must be real. So I was writing all this stuff in a journal. I've only got a couple of those journals left now because I got rid of them all. But that kind of tethered me to the earth. And I was mostly it was terrifying. Mostly what was happening was terrifying. But I was having these occasional, just incredible, beyond words experiences of oneness with the universe, and of standing on top of a mountain and just seeing everything that was beautiful, everything that was joyful, everything that was true laid out in front of me. And that was a really tiny percentage of what was happening, but it was huge and absolutely transcendent.
Having those experiences, did that make sense to you in around the wider context of what was happening? I mean, did having those experiences of oneness give you a lens through which to see or perceive the totality of what was happening?
No, not really, because when that was happening, I wasn't really aware. It was like I was many different people. And I was flipping between all of those. So I would have that experience, but then I would flip and it was very random and there was no warning. And I would flip into one of the other identities or experiences of being. And I had names for some of them. So the automaton, there was my little voice of reason. The little voice of reason was the one that used to whisper, "Don't tell the psychiatrists anything. And you're okay. It's okay. Just keep going. Now go and get on this train." So the automaton was very cold and official and officious. The little voice of reason was much softer and kinder. It was compassionate and wise. It was wise. I really trusted it. But then there were also some very destructive. I was hearing a lot of voices. By this time, I was hearing a lot of voices. And mostly they were indistinguishable from each other. I used to call this the cacophony. So it was like a crowd. It was like a football pitch full of really rowdy, aggressive, hateful beings. And some of them, I had a sense of who they were, and some of them were the priests and the nuns from when I was a child who told me I'd go to hell. And there were kids who'd bullied me at school, teachers who'd bullied me at school, right-wing politicians, demons and creatures that were kind of part dog and maybe a bit like hyenas, and just rabble banging saucepan lids and screeching, banshee screeching. And it was unbearable, filling my head and outside of my head. But occasionally it was like a group of them would get together, and the main message was, "It's time for you to die," in a really kind of nasty, vicious, malignant chorus. "It's time for you to die." And then there would be, they weren't voices, but there would be images of all the ways that I could kill myself. That felt like the overall message was, you need to take your life. And here's some ideas to help you on your way. So all of these things kind of I flipped from in different states. And sometimes the little voice of reason saved me from a few, really harmful situations.
The cacophonous malignant chorus, retrospectively, what's your sense now of what that was? Is it what we would call a shadow or something else?
I think it was definitely coming from the shadow. These are really thought-provoking questions. I haven't thought about this before. But I guess, yes, I think it was definitely coming from the shadow. And it was probably all that stuff that I'd pushed beneath the surface to protect myself as I was growing up. Yeah, I mean, there was the stuff about being evil. You're evil. I know through having done a lot of therapy since that I blamed myself for my father dying when I was 8. I believed that was because I was such a bad child. And I felt I wasn't conscious of this for a very long time, but I felt as though it should have been me. I was the one that the family could have done without. I was the one that the family would have been better off without. And now here I was with another family that I was failing. I couldn't look after my children. I was a burden to my mother. Everybody was terribly worried about me. And I think there was a connection there. You didn't die when you should have done when you were a child. That would have saved everybody so much trouble. You could have, daddy could have lived and nobody would have missed you in the way that they missed him. And now here I was again, messing things up for everybody. So I think there was probably an element of that.
It's just so heartbreaking, isn't it, that as children, I mean, I know my version of this, which is taking on this idea that it was my fault, that there was something irredeemably wrong with me. That added layer of being told at 4 years old that you're evil. I mean, I don't see where you can go with that, because we have, at that kind of age, we have no way of questioning that even.
No.
what else could we possibly do than push all of that down?
Yeah.
And then, of course, as we know, the pressure of having to keep that pushed down just, I think, becomes unbearable. That breaking forth of everything that's been kept down in that way. I'm curious about your sense of the psychosis diagnosis. How did that sit with you at the time, and how does that sit with you now?
At the time, on one level, I accepted it. There was a part of me that was relieved to know what was wrong with me, because clearly, on the human level, there was something very wrong with me. And I remember before I had that diagnosis, when I was just beginning to, I wasn't really thinking, I wasn't having thoughts, but there was, when I started to be in and out of consensus reality again, I wanted answers. It was like, what's happened? What's going on here? So at the time, I was okay to accept that. People were also at the day hospital. I remember asking, "What's wrong with me? What's my diagnosis?" And schizophrenia was offered, and I was very scared by that because I'd had a friend who'd taken his own life who had had a schizophrenia diagnosis, and I knew that was, or I believed that was something that was not curable, that I wouldn't come back from. That didn't stick. And later I discovered that schizophrenia was not something that you can diagnose someone with when they've been in an altered state for a couple of weeks, which was what they were doing. So I wasn't happy with that one, but psychosis was like, yeah, that's okay. Subsequently, I have quite a complicated relationship with the word. I can recognize and acknowledge that I met the criteria for a psychosis diagnosis. I also learned much later about the concept of spiritual emergency, and that I feel as though I fitted that much more closely and significantly. And I think if anybody had taken the time to sit with me and talk to me about what was going on without fear, it was like everyone was so scared or horrified or disgusted with what was going on. And this word psychosis was just loaded with, nasty, let's get rid of that. And I knew at the time that there was so much that was precious in there. Even if it was only a tiny percentage of the time, there was so much that was precious, and there was so much meaning that could have been unpicked. If I'd had help, if there'd been one person who had just taken an interest, who just said, okay, so what's going on here? What are you actually experiencing? That's interesting, isn't it? Let's think about that. What do you think it means? And it's okay, don't be scared. This happens to people. It's really interesting. Let's just unpick it together. I think that would have made so much difference, but it just escalated and escalated because everyone was throwing their hands up in the air and screaming and saying, oh my God, we've got to get rid of this. We've got to get you back to normal. I did not want to go back to normal. I knew whatever happened, I did not want to go back to the way I'd been before. Something had been opened and it was really precious, but there was no one who was willing to help me to explore or integrate that.
1,000% yes to all of that. I was fortunate in that within a few weeks of my dark night starting, I got the phrase dark night of the soul. And even though there were many, many, many times when I doubted that, people were saying to me, you're depressed, you're anxious. And I could see why that was their perception. And especially when those other experiences came in, I knew that this was a something. I knew there was something big going on. And I think to have had that framing, to have had that understanding, as you say, that it was a spiritual emergency and that there were, as you said, there were these huge insights that you were having that were so precious. As time went on, what then happened? Did you begin to have an understanding that there was a something going on, or how did this unfold?
I did. I had friends, as I said, I had good friends that I stayed with, and I had one friend in particular who'd done a lot of LSD, and he was the one person, and he struggled in his life, but he was the one person who was interested and who wanted to understand and to hear more, and I found that helpful a little bit at least, and remarkable things were happening. So I used to go to the library and just open a book. I would feel drawn to a particular book, and I would open a book and it would say exactly what I needed to read. It was absolutely uncanny. And I can't remember what they all were. I remember opening a book and reading about Plato one time, and it was just like, yes, this is exactly what's happening to me. And I came across The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran, and there was one quote that really carried me through. And I wrote it in pencil on the wall of all three of the places that I was staying. My friends were just so incredibly tolerant and accepting. I did do it in pencil so it would rub off. But it was, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. And that was it. That was my mantra. That was my reassurance. I repeated it to myself over and over and over. Yeah, and I just kept finding these little snippets of affirmation. And also, I was drawn to places with no logic. I just found myself hitching to places. I mean, there was some rationality. I would suddenly think, I've got to go to this place, and it would be a compulsion. And the first one was Avebury. I remember going to Avebury on Christmas Eve. I got a friend to drive me there in his van, and I needed to go to Avebury and be with the Stones. I'd been there before. And I climbed Silbury Hill, which, again, was a compulsion. And I just needed to be there and feel the power of the earth. And I remember standing in a particular place, and a man came up and stood a little way away from me. We didn't speak or have any kind of interaction, but there was something really significant about this man just standing there, and the connection of the masculine and the feminine, the balance. And I was having lots of those kinds of experiences. And then on my birthday, so these were significant dates. On my birthday, it was my 30th birthday, and I was I was expecting not to stay alive for much longer. I really felt like I was losing against the voices, and it wasn't going to be long before they had their way. And I had to climb Glastonbury Tor. I'd been to Glastonbury Festival, but I'd never climbed Glastonbury Tor. And on my 30th birthday, I climbed Glastonbury Tor, and I was completely convinced it was going to be my last birthday. And then a little while after that, 2 weeks after that, I saw a picture of St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, in Penzance. And I felt electrified by seeing this picture in a book. And then I forgot about it. And then I had a really, really upsetting experience. I'd started seeing a counsellor, and I thought that she was going to really help me. And she told me she couldn't see me anymore. I think she was out of her depth. And I was going to jump under a train. And instead, I went to the bus station. I just kind of veered off and went to the bus station and got on a bus to Land's End. And what I expected to do, again without thoughts, it was images. When I was 16, a friend from school rode his motorbike off the cliffs at Land's End. So I thought I was going to go to Land's End, or I pictured going to Land's End and jumping off the cliff. But that's where St. Michael's Mount is. So I got to Land's End, and there was St. Michael's Mount. And again, I was electrified by being in this place and seeing. I didn't know anything about it really, but seeing it. And I spent about 2 weeks traveling around on buses, just being drawn. I stayed in a bed and breakfast. I mean, I organised all of this. The automaton jumped in and organised all of this. And every day I went to the cliffs, and it was March, but it was a year of unprecedented winds. It was really windy. And I would stand on the edge of the cliff with my arms wide open, willing the wind to blow me off, and looking down at this swirling mess of waves and rocks hundreds of feet below, but not jumping. So offering myself to the elements, but not jumping. And then I spent time in the sea and lying on the grass, and I felt such a sense of connection with the landscape and with nature and with the stones in particular, the granite. And I started to perceive all the different elements and minerals as members of my family. So my mother, the sea, my father, the sky. Again, I didn't know anything about indigenous practices, and I found much more out about those things later. But I was part of this family, which was the family of nature, of the landscape, of the elements. And it was incredible. And still I was thinking, this is great. When I was thinking, this is great, but eventually I'll jump. But let's explore this a little bit more first. And then one day I was standing on the edge of the cliff, looking down, see crashing waves that were potentially devouring, but in a benign way. I felt as though when I was ready to jump, I would be lovingly received, and it would be a relief, and my body would break open, and whatever it was that needed to escape, that was me and my essence, would finally escape. And that's what I longed for. But this one day I was standing looking down, and there was a huge rock in the sea a little way out, and the waves were battering it from all different directions. And I was just watching these waves battering this rock, and I suddenly became the rock. And I experienced myself as this rock that had been battered by the waves and by the elements forever, and was still standing and was still strong and beautiful. And then gradually I started to perceive myself as the grass and the sky and all the elements of the landscape, and then all the elements beyond the landscape, everything in existence, and also nothing. And it was so profound, and it probably didn't last all that long. And then I had this sense of having been there on that cliff countless times, infinite times before, and having gone through life and got to that point and then ended my life, and then just gone through it all again and again and again. And it was like a memory, and it was such a certainty. And there was this thought that wasn't a thought, which was, I have to break the pattern now. If I jump, it's just going to all happen again. And I have to break the pattern. And with that thought that wasn't a thought, any possibility of suicide was gone. And that was a loss. That was a real loss, because it meant I had to live, and I had to find some way back to my family, back to functioning in the consensus world. And that was not going to be easy. But I spent a little bit more time in Cornwall, and then I went back to where I was living at the time, which was in Reading, I think. Yeah, in the southeast. I went back to see the psychiatrist, and I said to him, look, this amazing thing's happened, and I'm feeling much better. And I knew about a therapeutic community. I'd had a friend who'd gone there, which was full-time psychotherapy, Monday to Friday. People could stay up to 2 years. And my friend had a really good experience there. And I said to the psychiatrist, can you refer me to this place? And he said, no, you're too out of touch with reality to go to the therapeutic community. You need to be admitted to the hospital, and you need to take medication, and, same thing. So I just said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I left, but I was absolutely distraught. And I went to stay with a friend who had children the same age as mine. And it broke my heart being with her children and not being able to be with mine. And after a couple of days, I just thought, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to admit myself to the hospital and I'm going to take the medication because I can't do this anymore. And I got on a train back to the hospital and I just sobbed all the way there. But I knew I was invisible, so it didn't matter. Nobody could see me. And when I got there, I went to reception still sobbing. And I said to the receptionist, I need to see, I'm going to call him Dr. Turner, which was not his name. He's probably long dead, but still. Don't know why I should have any feelings of integrity towards him, but I do. And it was a Saturday. And the receptionist said, I'm sorry, he's not here. He doesn't work on Saturdays, but I'll get the duty doctor, the duty psychiatrist. And I waited for a little while and this woman appeared. And she came up to me and she was holding her hand out before she got to me. And she took my hand and shook it with both of hers. And she said, I'm Dr. Jahan. That was her real name. I'm Dr. Jahan. What's your name? And I told her. And she said, come and have a cup of tea. I don't drink tea. All these people are offering me tea. But it was really symbolically wonderful to be offered another cup of tea. And she took me to a room and left me sitting in a comfy chair with a box of tissues and went away and came back with a tray with a teapot and cups and a plate of custard creams. I remember they were custard creams. And then she sat down and said, tell me what's brought you here today. And I just talked to her and I told her what had been happening and she listened and she cared, you know, I could feel it. She wasn't a corpse. She was warm and alive. And she was just this lovely woman who listened to me. The fact that she was a psychiatrist was important to me, but actually what she did, any compassionate human being could have done. And she listened and she asked some questions and she made some notes. And I'd said to her, you know, I'm hopelessly insane and I need to be admitted to the hospital and I need some medication and I can't carry on any longer. And I told her about the little light and that was why I'd been refusing medication, but I'd come round now. And she listened to me and she heard me out. And then she said, thank you for telling me your story. She said, I'm not going to admit you to the hospital. And I was indignant. I was like, what? Taken me this long and I'm finally ready to do as I'm asked and you're not going to admit me to the hospital. And I said, why not? And she said, I don't think you're mentally ill. She said, I think you've got serious social problems and I think you're heartbroken and devastated. But if I admitted you to the hospital today, I don't think you'd come out. I think you could become mentally ill. You're very vulnerable and I don't think it would be safe for you. She said you'd be better off going to a women's shelter than being admitted to hospital. And then she said, and I'm not going to prescribe medication either because I want you to keep that little light alive and I want it to grow. And I was probably with that woman for an hour maximum, maybe an hour and a half. And I never saw her again. And I didn't know what to do with myself because I'd so psyched myself up for this. But I left and I went back to see my GP, who was also a lovely woman, a couple of days later. And I told her what had happened. And she said, what do you want? What do you think would help? And I said, I'd like to be referred to this therapeutic community. And she referred me and I was there within 2 weeks.
What strikes me so powerfully is that how little time it took for you to actually get what you needed. You know, after all of that time, it takes an hour of listening and actually perceiving accurately what's going on. And then somebody to ask such a simple question, what do you need?
Yeah, that psychiatrist saw me. You know, she was a human being and she saw me as a human being. She didn't look at me as a collection of symptoms. She wasn't looking to slap a label on me. She didn't have an agenda in her head, which is this is what we do with people like you. She saw me and she heard me and she responded from her heart. And it made such a difference. She turned my life around. I've tried to find her. I've tried quite hard to find her, and I haven't been able to. I don't know what happened to her because she doesn't know, and I would so like her to know. But I often train psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health workers, and I always tell them that story about this woman that I met for an hour who totally turned my life around. I don't know where I would be if Dr. Turner had been on duty instead of her.
I offer workshops to therapists and counsellors on the dark night. So knowing now that people in a position to do something when they meet somebody who's in spiritual emergency, I think makes so much difference, doesn't it? Because
It really does.
I think I've met so many people who haven't been met, who haven't been seen in this place, regardless of whatever their diagnosis might be, or even if they have one. I'd like to just talk a little bit more about the idea of spiritual emergency. I mean, I tend to use the phrase dark night of the soul because that's how it landed for me. But I use those terms more or less interchangeably. My sense is that in spiritual emergency, that there can be this tipping into what feels like non-consensual reality in a way that, I think they're really similar, but my sense is that the dark night is more of the kind of relentless battering of the waves on the rock. And maybe all of us have a mixture of both flavors. That was the case for me, that there was a period of time when, as I say, there wasn't quite that sense of not being in consensus reality, but it was a thin thread.
Yeah.
And I think this sense then that spiritual emergency or the dark night encompasses so much that it's coming to the fore of everything that's been kept down, as we were saying. It's a coming to light of the reality of our histories in a way that we've never experienced before. But it's also this much more ancient, deeper sense, I think, of coming back to our indigeneity. I mean, as you so beautifully described with your connection to very specific places, the connection with the land in that way, and coming back into a profoundly different sense of relationship with all of that, with what we might call past lives, all of those times of standing on the edge of the cliff and the land and our personal histories, that I think when we start to understand that it encompasses all of that, it starts to make more sense then of what our experience is.
Yes, definitely. Very much so. And I guess for me, just thinking back to everything that you just said then, I think for me, and I've never really thought about this in this way before, so I'm working stuff out. But I think maybe the spiritual emergency was the lid flying off the pressure cooker. There was so much that had been suppressed and contained and that had contaminated who I really was and how I really needed to be. And all of that exploded and made a huge mess. And it took a long time to start even making the first signs of cleaning it all up. And the therapeutic community was great because it helped me to find a way to live in the consensus world again and to be reunited with my children, which was the thing that was most driving me. That was the most important thing. And it was brilliant for that, but it wouldn't go anywhere near the therapists at the therapeutic community, wouldn't go anywhere near what had actually happened on a spiritual level, all that nasty psychosis stuff. You had to be in touch with reality to go there. I had to work really hard at clawing my way back to a place where I could at least appear to be in touch with the reality they wanted me to be in touch with. And that meant that I needed to shut the door on all the nasty psychotic stuff, which included the amazing, beyond description, spiritual awareness and all the new ideas and concepts that had just been beginning to unfold. I had to shut the door on all of that because I couldn't separate the two things. So I did that to quite an impressive extent. And I didn't realize until quite recently how damaging that was. So I was doing the same thing again. There'd been this eruption and loads of stuff had come out, but I didn't actually manage to deal with it in the way that I wanted to polish it and to allow it to shine and to find the meaning in it. And I think it was after that. So I got my children back. I got my life back. But I think I then went into what you're describing more as a dark night. So I didn't understand why I wasn't okay because I'd done all this therapy and I'd got what I wanted. And I was, as far as everybody else was concerned, I wasn't back to normal. I mean, I'd never been normal anyway by most people's description, by most people's definition, but I was functioning. And so mental health service were happy with that. I was functioning. I got my children back. I moved to Cornwall because I needed to be there. Then I did not understand why I wasn't happy. And what I didn't understand until again, very recently, was that it was not possible for me to be happy, to be a good mother, which was what I longed for more than anything else, when I'd experienced something so incredibly profound and also so incredibly terrifying and had no support in integrating it. It was not possible to just be plonked back in this ordinary, very mundane, really, compared to what I'd been experiencing, life, where nothing had been satisfied in me. All this stuff had come up, but it hadn't been explored. And I would say that then I went through quite a long dark night and I didn't really understand why. And now I do, but it's taken a long time.
All of that makes complete sense. I mean, I went through what I think of as a precursor to the dark night around the time that your lid had flown off. So around 89, 1991. And I think it's very difficult to convey how different things were in this landscape. I mean, things are not great now, but at that point, it was virtually impossible to really find anywhere to talk about all of this stuff. And of course, we didn't have the internet. And so, I really get how that the only option would feel like just shutting all of that down again. I love that you use the word integrate because I think that's so important. And that's certainly my work with people, is to not differentiate, in a sense, to not rule out one set of experiences, but allow another, but rather to create the space in which all of it can be here, the hellscape or the oneness or all points in between. All of that can be given its space and have equal validity, to be come into relationship with in a way that doesn't, that isn't about trying to stop one set of experiences at such great cost, really. I mean, I think just a huge cost in doing that. I just wanted to go back to the Kahlil Gibran quote, because that feels like it sums it up so perfectly. Pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. I mean, there's something so perfect about the way that names the extent of that understanding, that I think we're not just talking about some sort of more psychological, personal understanding, but rather these huge insights that you were having about the nature of wider reality. The reality, maybe we could say, in which consensual reality is happening, but is a small part.
Yeah, I was going to say I was so lucky to find that quote, and I don't remember where I found that book. I think it was in a friend's house. But as I say, I just felt guided to all these places and books and resources, and that was the one. Which still, I don't have it written on my wall anymore, but it's still there. It's because it's just so rich. You know, your pain is a gift. If it is going to yield greater understanding, then it's a gift. And I think that was probably the seed that bloomed into a belief that I've carried with me, a certainty that I've carried with me, which is that there is always learning and there is always a gift. And it can be really difficult to hold on to that when you're in the midst of something really excruciatingly painful. But I don't think there has yet been a situation where I haven't thought, okay, what is the gift in this? What is the understanding that this is going to yield?
Absolutely. I'm reminded of what you heard going into all of this at the very beginning when you heard, when you said, I'm having a breakdown. It's going to last a long time and it's going to be the best thing that
Yeah,
happened to me. And I so relate to that. I think there's always that sense, isn't there, of I wouldn't wish going through that on anybody. And
yeah,
I'm so grateful to have gone through it.
yeah,
And I think we hold the paradox of that. And in coming together with other people who are going through this, we're holding the possibility of that being the best thing, even when other people can't. And
mm,
Lord knows there was tons of times when I couldn't access that at
yeah, me
all
too.
because it's so difficult. So I don't think we're talking about holding that all the time or somehow using that in order to circumvent the pain or any of that. But I think there's something about saying that that is our experience,
Yes,
that
yeah.
we're so profoundly grateful. Just one more question to anybody who's right in it just now, whose his lid has just blown off. What would you like to share?
Oh, it's a difficult one. I mean, I very, very frequently come across people who are in that situation. And I guess the thing that I say and I would say is trust yourself, even when it seems like the most impossible, the most crazy thing to do. There is something in you that is going to help you get through this if you listen. And having said that, I feel like it's a bit trite because everybody's experience is different. And for some people, that's not the truth. That voice that came out of me that said this is the best thing that will ever happen to you is it. I don't know where that came from. And it was profound and it was a gift. And I very, very often didn't believe it while I was in the depths of despair, but it was there. It was always there. And I guess maybe I would say to people to be aware that there are many parts to every human being and to call upon maybe a different part just to look for what are the different parts of me. I've done a lot of work with groups of all kinds around subpersonalities because as I recovered gradually from the cacophony, particularly, and they started to dwindle down to just a few voices. And then I found the most wonderful transpersonal therapist who helped me to learn about archetypes and subpersonalities, the different parts of ourselves, and also the um, the collective, the archetypes, the kind of collective beings that are out there that we can connect with. So I don't know, and it's really difficult. And I do have a sense of who am I to tell anybody what they should do, but just to be open to the fact that we are, we contain multitudes. As you know, that Walt Whitman poem really speaks to me. We contain multitudes, and sometimes we are only able to experience this one story, this one reality that we believe to be the only one, and it never is. And there is so much more to us, and there is so much more to the world that we can tap into if we can just maybe find some stillness and not panic. Don't panic. That's the worst thing. You know, I panicked. I was terrified, and nobody said, okay, take some deep breaths and you're okay. And I wonder what's happening here. Isn't this fascinating? So I guess maybe that's what I'm saying to that person out there. This is fascinating. I wonder what's happening. Just look a bit further. Allow the answers to come to you.
Tam, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight.
Likewise, thank you.